Among the small set of terms being examined, only one other word besides aucel clearly points toward the calendar. It is idolis, described as a sheep offered on the Ides. Its ending, ulis, looks like a familiar kind of formative suffix found in Celtic patterns. The same sort of ending that appears in words meaning like, as, or such. That resemblance matters because it touches a bigger argument. Some very ordinary Latin ideas may have been expressed through forms that already existed in older neighbouring languages, rather than being invented entirely inside Latin itself. A good example is the Latin word for similar. It is often treated as if it belongs naturally to Latin, yet a comparable structure can be explained more cleanly if one begins with early Celtic building blocks for even, also, and like, then adds a demonstrative meaning, this or so, and finally arrives at an adjective meaning such. This kind of step-by-step assembly can produce a form that lines up with Latin similar, while also explaining why a straightforward Latin-only origin is hard to show. The Ides themselves were explained by ancient authorities as the point that splits the month. At first glance, it seems easy to connect the word for Ides to Latin roots associated with separating or dividing. The trouble is that the Etruscan form is not comfortably treated as a loan from Latin, because Etruscan is not the younger language in that relationship. So the argument turns outward, looking for an older bridge that can explain both the Etruscan shape and the Latin meaning. One proposed pathway begins with an ancient word meaning between or middle, a word that can be matched across Indo-European and also hinted at through Semitic parallels. In Hebrew, for instance, there are verbs meaning to halve or to divide, and nouns meaning the middle. If one imagines a sequence of sound adjustments that are common in language change, a form meaning middle can drift toward a form that resembles the Etruscan term for Ides, and from there into the Latin spelling. Once that between idea is established, other Latin words for between, middle, or amid can be placed into the same family by similar sound shifts, including the familiar Latin word for between and the Latin adjective meaning middle. The point of bringing in Hebrew here is not to claim Latin borrowed directly from Hebrew, but to show how the same root idea can be reshaped into different consonant patterns, and how those patterns can help explain why several languages end up with related meanings, even when the exact forms differ. Seen from that angle, the Ides make perfect sense. They fall near the middle of the month and divide it into two halves. In that case, idolis is treated as an adjective built in the same way Latin forms adjectives, meaning belonging to, or connected with. It would simply mean the animal associated with the Ides, the sheep that belongs to that mid-month point. Other scholars have proposed different explanations. One view keeps the divide meaning, but treats the Etruscan and Latin forms as directly tied to a shared root associated with splitting, and points to Latin verbs for dividing and cleaving as supporting evidence. Another suggestion tries to connect the Ides to a concept of oath or trust, treating the day as a kind of day of credit or pledge. A third proposal looks in a different direction again, offering a non-Indo-European explanation and connecting the term to a word meaning sheep, then linking it to the Etruscan form. The debate itself shows how attractive the middle dividing the month idea is, while also revealing how uncertain the deeper ancestry of the word remains once Etruscan is taken seriously as an older partner. From this discussion of time terms, attention shifts to a well-known funerary formula found on Etruscan monuments. The name of the deceased is followed by a short pair of words and then a numeral. The second word is remarkably stable, while the first appears in a few closely related spellings. Early interpreters took the phrase to mean something like, "he lived so many years," but a closer look at the different ways the formula appears suggests something slightly different. The phrase behaves as if it is pointing to a specific year of age, not simply counting years lived in a loose way. In other words, the wording seems closer to "in the 53rd year of age" than to "lived 53 years," even though both ideas can end up describing the same reality. Whether the numeral is meant to be ordinal becomes a crucial question. There are cases where the number is written out rather than given only in symbols, and those expanded forms look like they are built the way ordinals are built in Celtic traditions, especially in the endings attached to higher ordinal numbers. Latin ordinals above third also share a recognizable ending pattern, and the resemblance is stronger there than it is in Greek. That matters because it opens a route for explaining how an Etruscan written number could reflect an ordinal structure without needing to assume the system was borrowed from Greek. When an ordinal reading is applied to one especially striking example found on a sarcophagus, the phrase fits the context of the sculpture, which depicts an elderly man. The reading becomes "in the 103rd year of age," which matches what the monument seems to be communicating. If that approach is accepted, then the stable word in the funerary formula is understood as year, and the variable word as age. Another funerary term sometimes appears as well, and it can be read naturally as something like "with us," creating an expression that feels familiar across cultures. A person was with the living for a certain span, and then belongs among the dead. A separate verb in the inscriptions is taken by some to mean "he died," which would harmonize with the age and year phrasing in the epitaphs. To test whether the stable word really means year, the argument steps back and surveys how many languages name the year. Across Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic traditions, Greek, Latin, Germanic, and Celtic, a repeated theme appears. The year is imagined as a turning, a circling, a returning. Sometimes the word for year is visibly tied to the sun, sometimes to repetition, sometimes to a cycle. But the underlying picture is the same. A year is not just a count of days. It is the return of the same sky patterns, the same seasonal landmarks, the same loop of light. Egyptian offers a striking illustration. The word for year can be linked to the sun itself and to a symbol of circular motion, the disk. The same circular idea shows up in Greek words for spinning and whirling, and in Celtic words for a ring or a curved bay. Hebrew expresses the year through repetition and doing something a second time, again reinforcing the cyclical idea. Aramaic has a term that can mean time generally, and also year specifically, tied to a root involving duration or progress. Greek uses more than one word for year, but several of them point toward recurrence, returning again, and turning through a cycle. Latin year can be connected to the idea of a ring, and even the diminutive ring preserves the older image. In Germanic, the modern word does not obviously advertise the cycle, but older forms connect it to words for describing a circuit. Even the old midwinter festival name associated with the turning of the sun is linked to a wheel image, a sign that people once thought of the season as the sun's turn and return. The beginning of another great loop. Celtic names for the year can also be interpreted as the cycle of the sun, with elements that point toward a solar name and an act of going around. If all of this is gathered into one picture, the case becomes straightforward. In many unrelated branches of language, year carries the idea of turning around, circling back, repeating the same cosmic sequence, and doing so under the authority of the sun. With that background, the Etruscan funerary year word is then compared to roots meaning to roll or to turn. A Semitic verb meaning to roll in a circle has multiple forms that range in their consonants, and the series invites a missing H grade, which can be supplied by Celtic forms where an aspirated sound is pronounced like an H. That helps build a chain of plausible shapes leading to a noun meaning circle, and then, by a small consonant change, to the Etruscan funerary term. This is still a reconstruction rather than a certainty, and the argument admits that. Yet it also answers two natural doubts: whether anything like this word exists in Celtic at all, and whether a verb to turn can really give rise to a noun year. Both are treated as possible. Celtic preserves words tied to circling and rolling, including terms for reels and rolling motions, and the dance, called a reel itself, is described as a living picture of rotation and returning. And in Arabic, a related form does in fact carry the meaning year, which shows that the semantic leap from circling to calendrical time is not far-fetched. Once year seems secure, the variable word in the funerary formula can be approached as an age. Here, several solutions are explored. One path treats it as life or existence, formed through a possessive element and a word meaning life, yielding something like of one's life. Another begins with Celtic terms for age and suggests that sound changes and euphony can reshape a form into the Etruscan spelling found on monuments. A third route starts even deeper, connecting age to an ancient root involving movement, flowing and going onward. In that picture, a lifetime is imagined as a stream that moves forward, and age becomes the measure of that flowing passage. From there, an adjective meaning temporal or seasonal can be created, and a noun meaning our time of life can be formed without needing to borrow directly from Latin or Greek. That last reading is offered with a sense that it captures the tone of funerary language, a human life as a bounded season, a swift current, a limited span measured against something far larger. Scholars who tried to explain the funerary pairing often began by admitting a basic problem. The word for year does not look obviously at home in the usual Indo-European lists. Yet that fact alone proves very little. Languages can share deep kinship even when the everyday synonyms drift far apart. And even within well-accepted families, the common words for year can look surprisingly unrelated on the surface. One line of interpretation treats the Etruscan term as a form built around an ancient idea of movement and flow. In that view, the core meaning is not year as a number on a calendar, but a turning course, time understood as motion that returns. From that starting point, the Latin notion of the year as a cycle fits naturally, because Latin itself carries the image of a ring and a returning curve in its own word for the year. Another approach pushes the argument in a more northern direction, looking to Germanic vocabulary, where the year can be described as something that revolves, and where words for rolling and turning sit close to words for time. A related proposal extends the same logic to the accompanying age word, treating it as a term for a measured span, an allotted portion of time that might mean a moment, an hour, a year, or a lifetime depending on context. There are also models that step outside Indo-European entirely and argue from usage rather than ancestry. In several languages, summer can stand in for year, because a life measured in summers is still a life measured in years. With that in mind, it becomes tempting to compare the Etruscan form to words in the Caucasus that label the warm season, and then to connect those to Turkic and Mongolic terms, where the year appears in shapes that resemble a simple syllable meaning year or cycle. From this perspective, one expects a family of forms that shift between initial sounds while keeping the same compact body, producing variants that can look like eel, gil, or similar. The accompanying age word is treated as part of the same field of meaning, and some readers argue that an Etruscan spelling that looks like it carries an AJ sound could align with a Turkic word connected to what is coming, what is appointed, and eventually the idea of a destined time. In that reading, age and year are not separate concepts, but two faces of the same mechanism, the turning of time, counted and fixed. Not everyone accepts these bridges. One influential analysis treats the two-word funerary formula as flexible in grammar and insists that the second term can be read as either singular or plural. If plural, then the numbers following it are taken as simple counts and the whole phrase becomes years old. If singular, then the numbers behave like ordinals and the phrase becomes in the nth year of age. This debate matters because the inscriptions often feel formulaic and stable, yet small shifts in interpretation change the sense from a plain statement of lifespan to a more formal placement within the sequence of years. In the same analysis, the age word is not treated as a direct match for the Latin vocabulary of lifetime, but as an adjective built with a familiar ending that creates meanings like youthful or elderly. The year word is then linked to an old idea of ritual course or flowing movement, a concept that can be traced through forms meaning going, moving, or running. Under that model, the year term becomes the accusative object of time, so the phrase reads as years, and the grammar aligns with a straightforward count. From funerary time, the discussion widens to landscape and sky, because another pair of Etruscan words seems to share a single root. One is glossed as mountains, the other as the sky. Their endings look like common add-ons used to make plurals or form descriptive adjectives in older Celtic patterns, which makes the shared stem even more important. The key question becomes what kind of basic idea could connect a mountain to the sky? Ancient imagination supplies an answer easily. Mountains were seen as the world's meeting point, with the upper realm. Myth after myth places gods on a high peak, sets blessed lands on a sacred mountain, or describes heaven itself with words that also mean height. Even in ordinary speech, heaven can be pictured as something lifted up, while the sky can be pictured as a covering stretched above the earth. Across languages, several recurring images appear in the words for sky and heaven. Some languages name it as a covering, something that shields the world. Others describe it as an expanse spread out like a sheet. Some define it as height, the raised region overhead. Others focus on air and atmosphere, the invisible medium between Earth and the higher lights. These themes turn up repeatedly in different families, and that variety becomes a tool. If an Etruscan root is being tested, it should be able to attach itself to one of these common ideas in a convincing way. The covering idea is especially powerful. In Germanic, a word for heaven can be linked to the sense of a roof or canopy, and even to the idea of home as a protected interior. In English, sky itself has a history tied to cloud and covering, while firmament points to the older belief that the upper region was fixed and solid compared to the shifting weather below. Ancient Near Eastern language uses multiple terms that describe heaven as height, as a beaten-out expanse, or as a barrier dividing waters above from waters below. Early Greek poetry also imagines the upper world as a kind of metallic spread, with lights fastened to it, a picture that later cultures echoed when they spoke of stars fixed in the sky. These images differ, but they share the same habit. Heaven is defined by function, as what covers, what encloses, what rises, what stretches, what separates. When the Etruscan mountain and sky root is tested against this pattern, one proposal argues that its oldest sense is to cover, to enclose, to hedge in. That meaning produces natural descendants. Fences, folds, walls, shelters, veils, screens. From there, it is only a short step to the sky as the great cover above, and to mountains as the enclosed ridges and protective boundaries of a landscape. The same covering route can also slide into ideas like protection, guardianship, and authority, because what covers also shields, and what shields can rule. Under that logic, the language of shelter grows into the language of power. A term that begins as covering can end up naming not just a roof or a cloud, but a lordly protector, and from that, the heavens can be described as a realm of protectors, a dominion overhead. To strengthen the case, this approach looks for parallel roots in older Semitic vocabulary that mean to hide, to cover, or to cloud over, and then traces how such roots can shift sounds as they move into other families. A single ancient base can generate words for house, tent, cottage, or dwelling, all of them tied to the act of covering. The same base can produce words for darkness or cloud because cloud cover and hiddenness belong together. Another branch can produce terms for rafters and beams, covering understood as roofing with timber. In Celtic, the covering idea spreads into a network of words meaning to conceal, to veil, to screen, and even to deceive, because deceit is a kind of hiding. In the same web, words for a protective fold or enclosure sit close to words for shelter. The safe side of a hill, the place where someone finds cover from wind or danger. From this cluster of meanings, a sky word can arise naturally as that which covers, and a mountain word can stand as that which encloses and bounds, a high ridge that frames the world beneath the cover of heaven. Once the sky term has been linked to a root idea of covering and sheltering, it becomes tempting to treat the mountain term as its natural partner. Many ancient cultures did exactly that in thought, even when their words differed. High ridges were not only dramatic features of the landscape, they were also imagined as protective barriers that hold a country and as elevated places from which divine forces could watch over the land below. A similar pairing appears in Greek vocabulary, where a word for heaven seems to sit close to words for mountains and boundaries. Some interpreters prefer to read the Greek heaven word as a simple reference to height, but there is another possibility. A related Greek form can mean a watcher or guard, and that sense fits the older picture of the sky as something that covers and protects. If a mountain can be a boundary, and a boundary can be a form of protection, then the mountain word could reasonably grow out of the same conceptual soil as the sky word. Yet there is an alternative that may fit mountains even more tightly. The idea of division rather than shelter. Mountains do not only cover, they separate. They draw lines between valleys, peoples, climates, and provinces. The very shape of a range encourages the human mind to treat it as a frontier. Ancient languages often reflect this by naming mountains with words that originally mean to bound, to cut, or to split. A parallel can be found in a Semitic mountain term that is explained from a verb meaning to limit or mark off. That limiting sense itself may be older still, connected to an image of twisting a rope, the kind of rope that can measure, tie, and mark an end. In that view, a mountain is not a roof over the land, but a line across it, a natural edge, a divider. To pursue that second route, attention shifts to a very old root meaning to cleave or separate. It appears across languages in forms that produce words for sharing, dividing, taking apart, and marking out portions. In Celtic speech, this separating idea shows up clearly in words for a share and for the act of sharing, very close in shape to the familiar Latin family that includes part. The same separation logic can be extended to water. Rivers and seas frequently function as boundaries, and it is not unusual for older vocabularies to build sea or river names from roots that mean to divide. Even the English habit of using bourne for a boundary sits in that tradition, where flowing water becomes the line that cuts one region from another. Celtic also preserves boundary words that look as if they come from the same dividing root. There are terms for ridges and borders, and there is a strong pattern of combining that boundary idea with elements meaning around, producing words that describe a frontier in a very literal sense, the edge that runs around a territory. This opens a straightforward possibility for the mountain term. It could be built from a boundary route and applied to ranges because they form the most visible borders in nature. However, there is also a third nuance that complicates the picture because ridges do not only divide and protect, they also serve as lookout points. A hilltop is where someone goes to watch the approaches, survey the landscape, and keep guard. Celtic vocabulary includes a hill word that carries both meanings, a raised place and a watch place. That double sense becomes especially interesting because an ancient lexicon glosses the Etruscan mountain term using Greek words associated with peaks and lookout posts. In other words, the mountain is described not only as a high feature, but as a point from which one watches. When that clue is taken seriously, the Etruscan mountain word can be explained as a relative of a Celtic term for a watch hill, which in turn belongs to the larger family of forms connected to enclosing, guarding, and sheltering. Under this reading, the mountain term is not simply high place, but the watched place, the ridge that functions as a natural watchtower. At that stage, the mountain word can be explained in two different but compatible ways. One path makes it the child of covering, treating mountains as protective walls of the land. Another makes it the child of separating, treating mountains as natural borders and dividing lines. The lookout meaning sits between them because a border is guarded and a guarded line is watched. The safest conclusion is that both ideas may have been active in the way people felt about mountains, even if only one of them shaped the original word. Other scholars offered very different explanations. Some tried to connect the sky term to words for baldness or brightness, pushing it toward a light origin rather than a covering origin. Others proposed an analysis based on upper region, comparing it to northern mythic language where heaven is described as the world above. Another approach collected words from Ugric languages that combined sounds resembling the same root with meanings like high, mountain, cloud, and sky. Still, another argument compared the Etruscan forms to Northern European words for enclosures and beams, interpreting the sky not as light, but as a kind of roof. The discussion then pivots away from landscape and into social roles, beginning with an Etruscan word used for a man known not by family ties, but by behaviour. Ancient sources made it clear that this term meant something like a profligate, an intemperate figure, and that it cannot be equated with a Latin family word that happens to look similar. The two words point in completely different directions, and it would be strange for any language to use the same form for grandson and debauchee, unless the connection were accidental or imposed later. One proposal links the Etruscan insult to an Albanian word meaning glutton, but that alone does not explain its deeper origin. Another explanation tries to build it from Celtic components. In that model, the word is understood as a negative prefix attached to a term meaning measure or moderation. The result is not simply bad, but unmeasured, beyond restraint. The logic fits the social meaning well. A profligate is a person without measure. The measure element itself can be traced into a broad family of words for measuring, calculating, weighing, and even naming the month as a unit of counted time. The point is not that one language must have borrowed directly from another, in a simple way, but that the internal structure of the Celtic form is transparent in a way the Etruscan and Albanian forms are not. That transparency is treated as evidence of greater age, or at least greater clarity in preservation, because it shows how the word is built and what each part contributes. A further wrinkle is the final consonant. The Etruscan spelling that survives in Latinized form might not preserve the original ending sound precisely. Some scholars argue that the Etruscan may have ended with a sound closer to an aspirated consonant, and that later Latin writing smoothed it into a more familiar ending. If that is correct, it would place the Etruscan form even closer to the Celtic pattern, where certain consonants blur together in pronunciation. The Latin family word that looks similar is treated separately. Its vowel length and its ancestry do not match the insult term. Instead, it belongs to a different lineage connected with Indo-Iranian and Greek forms for descendants and family relations. In that system, the word is built from an old kinship root tied to child and offspring, combined with a prefix that signals derivation, meaning someone who is from a father or child line. The same family produces multiple related forms for grandson and nephew across languages. This is also where the instability of kinship vocabulary becomes important. Early societies often used the same term for different relatives, and meanings drifted as communities settled on new, more specific words for son, daughter, sister, and nephew. A term that once referred broadly to a child could narrow to sister in one language while remaining closer to child or boy in another. From there, the focus moves to another Etruscan role word, the name for a musician who played the double pipe at public and religious occasions. The figure is easy to picture. Two hollow reeds pierced with finger holes, held together at the mouth, producing a bright, controlled whistle tone. The instrument begins in the simplest material imaginable, a straw or a reed, and many ancient languages preserve the same connection between reed, pipe, and whistling. A striking pattern repeats across vocabularies. The word for the object and the word for the sound often share the same root, as though the language hears the instrument and names it by its breath. Several lines of evidence suggest that the Etruscan word is not a compound, but a root plus common endings. The sound family behind it appears in words meaning pipe, tube, whistle, hiss, and breath. Some languages preserve both a blow form and a hiss form, and Romance speech still shows the pair as separate verbs. Latin also carries a whistle word that resembles the Etruscan consonant frame, differing mainly in vowels. Meanwhile, Celtic languages preserve words for reeds and pipes that branch into modern pipe and fife families, and even show how an inserted consonant can produce forms resembling flute. Other branches of the same sound family link to whispering and soft breathing noises, suggesting that the root's oldest meaning may have been nothing more technical than the sound of air moving through a narrow hollow. A Semitic reed term also exists that seems difficult to derive internally, and it has been compared with a chain of European words for reeds, rushes, and similar plants. From that same family, it is easy to imagine a path toward words meaning siphon-like tubes and pipe instruments. Ancient descriptions of the double pipe also explain why double markers are sometimes attached to pipe words in older expressions. Two reeds, one mouth, one stream of breath split into two voices. Even a bagged version of this idea appears in old terminology, where the concept is essentially a paired pipe fed by a reservoir of air. After the musician, the next role word is far less delicate. The term for a gladiator trainer or an executioner is described as unmistakably Celtic in shape. A blade word plus an agent ending. The blade word itself carries an older image as well, brightness. A sword is the bright thing that flashes. The shine of new metal becomes the semantic seed of the weapon term. Many languages echo this association. Some name a sword by flame, imagery, others by burning, and even English keeps the connection in the old use of brand for a sword and the phrase brand new, where brightness and newness overlap. Celtic preserves the same pattern in a family of words meaning gleaming and radiance, and that family can also be related to a wider group of forms in which clean, glance, and shine share an underlying brightness idea. Finally, the discussion reaches the stage performer, whose work began as ritual rather than entertainment. The earliest version of this figure is not an actor delivering lines, but a dancer and gesturer performing in a sacred setting. Ancient accounts describe a performer moving to reed music using controlled, expressive motion without spoken verse. That picture matches early phases of drama in other cultures as well, where performance grows out of religious festivals. In Greek tradition, the earliest dramatic core is a chorus moving around an altar in patterned worship, and only later does a lead figure separate from the group to embody emotion through gesture and story. Roman practice begins with a crisis and a rite. Performers are brought in to calm divine anger, and then local youths imitate the style, gradually turning it toward humour and spectacle. The physical vocabulary of dance supports this origin. Words for leaping, trembling, stamping, and rhythmic footwork are closely related across older languages, often branching from roots that mean striking the ground or moving the feet rapidly. In Semitic speech, there are verbs that describe both trembling and dancing, and related forms connect dance with bodily worship, the bending and movement used in prayer. Celtic keeps a similar network. Words for step and pace also develop meanings like close following, quick movement, and even anger, as though emotional agitation and fast footwork were linked in the ear of the language. In the classical tongues, the foot root shifts into the familiar forms that build ped and pod, and from there it is not hard to imagine agent nouns that would mean the stepper, the trampler, the dancer. Under one reconstruction, a Celtic agent form meaning treader could, through ordinary sound changes, yield something like the Etruscan term later borrowed into Latin for stage players. The proposed path is phonetic rather than literary. A word shaped by breath and footwork becomes a label for the ritual dancer. And later, cultures broaden that label until it covers the whole craft of acting. The end result is a familiar historical pattern. Religion produces performance. Performance produces theatre. And a word that began with the stamp of feet and the sound of reeds survives as the name of the actor. The old Roman word tripudium has often been explained as a simple reference to stamping the ground. Yet a closer look at early ritual dancing suggests something more vivid. The performer known as the heister grew out of the chorus traditions associated with ecstatic festivals, particularly those linked to the wine god. Participants in such rites did not move calmly or with measured steps. They leapt, twisted, shook their arms, and flung their heads back in a frenzy of motion. Even if the Etruscan dancer was not limited to one specific cult, ancient descriptions make it clear that his movements were energetic and restless. If the first element of tripudium expresses this lively motion, the term begins to describe not merely 3 steps, but the spirited, bounding action of the feet. Celtic languages preserve several words that capture exactly this idea. One form describes skipping or leaping, another conveys trembling or shaking, a third suggests agility and swift motion. These are the kinds of movements that would characterize the ecstatic dancer. And even today, related expressions are used to describe the darting lights of the northern sky, known in Scotland as the merry dancers. When these meanings are placed beside the second element of tripudium, clearly connected with the foot, the whole phrase comes to signify nimble, animated footwork, the very quality that astonished Roman spectators when they first encountered Etruscan performers. The same interpretation also fits an old augural custom. An omen was favourable when sacred chickens rushed eagerly towards scattered grain, their quick, lively motions being described with the same word. Egyptian priests once read signs in a comparable way from the eagerness of a sacred bull accepting food. If the Etruscan term was later broadened to mean any stage performer, another Celtic explanation becomes possible. Words for play and acting can be traced to a root meaning to leap, from which expressions for joy and merriment also developed. Combined with a term for man, such a form would describe the man who leaps in the play, a vivid image of the earliest actor before spoken drama had fully emerged. Another parallel would connect the word with knowledge or message bearing, reflecting the role of the lead performer who communicated stories to the audience through gesture. The Roman equivalent for this figure was ludio, derived from ludus, meaning play or sport. That Latin term itself appears to echo Celtic vocabulary for games and festivities. In those languages, the notion of play is again tied to leaping and quick motion, and the words gradually expanded to include theatrical performances. Sacred games held in honour of the gods followed sacrifices with feasting and entertainment, and in such celebrations both the ludio and the hista found their place. What began as religious ceremony slowly turned into public amusement, turning from performers to names for people. An intriguing example is the Etruscan term used for a reckless or excessive man. Although it resembles the Latin word for grandson, the meanings cannot be related. Some have compared it with an Albanian term for gluttony, yet a more convincing explanation views it as built from elements meaning without measure. The idea fits the character perfectly, a person who ignores moderation. The same root for measure lies behind words for calculation, and even for the month as a counted period of time. The Latin kinship term, on the other hand, belongs to a completely different family, shared with Indo-Iranian and Greek forms, illustrating how identical shapes can hide unrelated histories. Another occupational word, the Etruscan name for a flute player, reflects the simple origins of early music. The instrument was little more than a pair of reeds pierced with holes, and many languages connect the concepts of reed, pipe, and whistling breath. Variations of the same root appear in words for hissing, blowing, and hollow tubes. Even modern Romance speech preserves twin verbs for hissing and for blowing that seem to descend from this ancient sound symbolism. Celtic dialects likewise retain terms for reeds that evolved into the modern words pipe and fife, while related forms describe whispering or the soft sigh of wind. A Semitic word for reed, difficult to explain internally, also fits neatly into this widespread family. All this suggests that the Etruscan term was not a complex compound but a straightforward descendant of an age-old root meaning whistle through a hollow stem. More grim is the term for a trainer of gladiators or an executioner. Here, the connection with Celtic speech is striking. The core of the word corresponds to a Celtic noun for a blade, itself derived from an older notion of brightness. Across cultures, the gleam of metal inspired the names of weapons. Swords were called flames or burning things, and English still remembers the link in the word brand. Celtic expressions for shining and radiance share this ancestry, and from the same source come Latin words for butcher and sword. The professional who dealt in blades thus carried a name built quite literally from the image of flashing steel. The Roman hista, later the general word for actor, originally belonged to the sphere of worship. Early accounts describe him dancing to reed music without spoken verse, a sacred performer rather than an entertainer. Greek drama followed a similar path, a chorus circling an altar, one member stepping forward to embody emotion, and only much later the appearance of scripted dialogue. In Rome, the craft was introduced to appease divine anger during a plague, and only gradually did the youths of the city imitate the style for amusement. Vocabulary connected with dancing across many languages links stamping, trembling, and prayerful movement, reinforcing the ritual background of the role. Finally, attention turns to military and everyday objects whose names reveal similar patterns. The Latin word for helmet once had a longer form that matches Celtic terms for round, vaulted shapes. A broad ancient root expressed the idea of something curved or hollow, and from it sprang words for head, cup, vault, and even cave. The same root explains names for hills and mountains conceived as rounded masses. From it also came terms for pits, wells, and underground chambers. Language shows how a single image, the bulging curve, could generate a multitude of meanings, each adapted by small changes in sound. Some older commentators argued that the Latin helmet word, later written as caesis, once appeared in a slightly different shape, closer to a form like copsis or capsis, and that the change in spelling only partly hides its relationship to the broader family of head words. Others prefer to explain it through an old idea found across northern languages, where the basic meaning is to guard, in the sense of to cover, as if the helmet is first and foremost a protective lid. There were also attempts to push the word toward more distant comparisons, linking it to notions of hair, roofs, tents, or excavated graves. What matters for a narrative view is not which single proposal wins outright, but the larger pattern these proposals circle around. Headgear is consistently described either by its purpose, by its shape, or by its material, and many ancient languages slide between these categories with ease. A similar uncertainty follows the underground chamber term, often rendered as favissa. Some explanations treat it as part of a broad pit and hollow family, like words for trenches, wells, and dugout spaces. Others prefer a closer connection to cave or hollow place, the sort of word that can describe anything from a depression in the earth to a hidden storage chamber beneath a sacred precinct. Even when different language families are brought in to support these readings, the core image stays steady. A protected, excavated space, typically associated with ritual deposits, storage, or burial-like containment. In that sense, the debate itself points to the same conclusion. The word belongs to the ancient vocabulary of digging, hiding, and enclosing. From helmets and hidden chambers, the discussion can move to an item that feels simpler, but turns out to be just as revealing: the belt. The Latin baltus, used especially for the military girdle, appears almost perfectly at home in Celtic speech, and it spread into several Northern European languages with remarkably little change. The shared forms suggest that this was not a late borrowing in one direction or another, but the survival of an old everyday word that travelled easily because the object was universal. The meaning sits on a straightforward physical idea. A belt is what goes around. It encircles, binds, tightens, marks an edge. Older English and Scots usage preserves this sense clearly in expressions that treat belt as an action, meaning to gird or surround, and even to brace oneself mentally for effort, as if girding up the mind were the same act as tightening a strap. This going round idea is also visible in related words that mean border, rim, or welt, because a border is simply what runs around the edge of something. That overlap hints that the final consonant found in some forms of the belt word is not essential to the root itself. Instead, it looks like an added sound that helped shape a noun or a participle, the way many languages create a thing that has been bound, from a verb meaning to bind. In the Celtic sphere, there are parallel terms for girdle that lean on the same circular idea found elsewhere in Europe, where a circle word can become a belt word because both are defined by enclosure. Behind that sits an even deeper layer of meaning: roundness, rolling, turning, and folding. Ancient roots that express levelling, revolving, and rolling often branch into words for belts, ringlets of hair, hems, and any kind of binding strip. Once the language has a basic verb for rolling or turning, it can apply that motion to cloth, leather, hair, rope, and even boiling water. That is why belt words sometimes appear beside words for bubbles and boiling, because boiling is motion that rolls and rises in the pot. The same underlying image can label very different things, and the shared logic is physical rather than abstract. After objects like belts and helmets, a much harder word appears, an abstract term glossed as sovereignty, often presented in a form like druna. The political background matters here. Etruria was not a single hereditary monarchy ruling the entire country as one kingdom. It functioned more like a league of cities and territories, each with its own leadership and institutions, yet capable of forming a larger union for defence or common action. In that kind of system, sovereignty can point in more than one direction. It might describe the authority of the leading man inside each city, or it might describe the temporary supreme command given to a chosen leader when the cities acted together. Without a detailed Etruscan dictionary to settle the nuance, the best approach is to track what the word seems built from and compare how similar political ideas are expressed elsewhere. The form suggests a compact root built around sounds like T and R, with the possibility that the word shifted through common sound rearrangements. That makes it tempting to compare it with ancient ruler words that resemble tyrant in Greek, or with names and titles linked to chiefs in early Italy and beyond. The deeper argument is that a cluster of ancient roots repeatedly ties rulership to protection. The king is imagined as the one who restrains danger, holds the land together, keeps the people safe, and watches over order. In Iranian royal names, for instance, the king is explicitly the protector, and the same thought appears in other Eastern naming patterns, where a deity protects the king, protects the sun, or protects the realm. That habit is more than poetic language. It reflects a political theology in which authority is justified as guardianship. In the Celtic languages, an old verb meaning to protect and preserve produces a network of words for protection, defence, and the protective role of a leader in war. These words also generate heroic adjectives, meaning brave, strong, magnanimous, and titles that describe a champion as someone who shields others. The idea can tighten into an abstract noun meaning protection itself, and from there it can widen again into rule or government, because in early political thinking, the right to command is intertwined with the duty to guard. A leader is not merely the one who gives orders, he is the one who stands between the community and harm. That same protective logic can be traced in titles given to chiefs. In Britain, older traditions describe a supreme leader chosen in times of need, and the famous head titles used for chiefs can be read as the protector at the top. Words that later became wrapped in mythic imagery can begin as sober political vocabulary. A dragon in some Celtic contexts, for example, can function as a title for a leading ruler, and the image of a guardian fits perfectly with that. In parallel, other Celtic terms for governor and supreme leader can be built from the idea of upper or highest, combining elevation with authority. The leader is the one above, not merely in status but in the sense of being placed over the people as a covering. This protective root also explains why words for defensive equipment can share the same family. A target is not a random object. It is literally that which protects. In that light, it becomes less convincing to treat such terms as late borrowings from Latin simply because Latin has a similar-looking word. The protective function is primitive, and languages with old warrior cultures often preserve their own native vocabulary for it. When the same root appears in titles, in shield words, and in abstract terms for rule, the pieces begin to align. Sovereignty is protection turned into authority. Northern myth also preserves a comparable picture. Old Norse terminology for kingship and divine descendants can be interpreted through the same protector-ruler concept. Some have tried to argue that the Etruscan word for sovereignty came from a Norse lord term, yet the relationship can just as easily be reversed. Or both can be seen as parallel developments from an older shared idea. In the lowlands of Scotland, later speech even carries a faint echo in words for nobles derived from the same kingly vocabulary, showing how long these notions can survive after the political systems that created them have disappeared. When the focus shifts from the abstract word itself to famous ethnic and dynastic names, the protective theme continues. The city known as Tarquinii stood as a major centre of government and religious authority in Etruria, and its wealth and tomb culture suggest a long-standing elite. Traditions connect it with a founding figure, often given a name like Tarchon, and the name looks as though it belongs to the same ruler-protector root family. Across the ancient world, similar syllables appear in names and titles used for generals, lawgivers, and founding heroes, often tied to the idea of command, headship, or protective oversight. The recurrence across regions can be read as evidence not of a single direct line, but of a shared habit. Great leadership is described as the act of guarding. This helps frame the Greek ethnic label, often applied to the Etruscans, and also the Greek word for an absolute ruler. The ruler term in Greek carries a foreign flavour in its ending, and it sits close to a Celtic-style pattern in which a root for lordship takes a common tribal or collective suffix. That suggests an interpretation in which the ethnic label means something like the ruling folk, the leader people, the community defined by a warrior elite. Such a reading also matches how the tombs present Etruscan society. Not as a rustic population of tower builders, but as an aristocratic culture that expressed status through ritual, wealth, and a strong sense of lineage. Another self-designation for the Etruscans has been transmitted in a form like Racena. Some doubted its authenticity because it is rare in surviving literature, but it fits neatly with a widespread ancient habit of naming peoples as headmen, meaning leaders, chiefs, or the foremost group. In Semitic and Iranian speech, the word for head often expands into chief and prince, because the head is both physically highest and symbolically first. If Racena belongs to that family, it becomes a near twin in meaning to the ruling folk label discussed above. Not a different identity, but the same status described with a different metaphor. Titles used within Etruria reinforce that political structure. The Latinized form lucumo points to Etruscan chiefs, who ruled individual communities, with a leading figure chosen periodically as a ceremonial head for the wider league. Comparable arrangements appear in other early confederations, where kingship begins as elective leadership, rather than permanent hereditary monarchy. The internal form of the title can be read as hero, plus a greatness element, yielding something like great hero or mighty champion. a natural designation for a war leader in a society that honours martial distinction. That interpretation also aligns with the Celtic tendency to multiply words for hero and to treat glory as a social ideal. The title becomes less a bureaucratic office name and more a cultural statement about what leadership is supposed to be. The final thread ties these political ideas back into religion. In both Etruscan and Roman mythic naming, there is a recurring ending found in many divine names, sometimes appearing as a fuller form and sometimes softened. The gods who carry it are typically guardians or patrons, the power that watches over harbours, the force that protects life, the deity who presides over change, seasons, exchange, and the shifting rhythm of the year. Roman religion, like many polytheistic systems, assigns oversight to countless domains, including the smallest daily acts. Ancient critics mocked the abundance of such gods, but the underlying impulse is coherent. Life is full of risks and unknowns, and protection can be requested for every threshold and every turning point. In that religious atmosphere, it makes sense that divine names would include a marker, meaning protector, or guardian. Comparable patterns appear far beyond Italy. In Mesopotamia, royal names often declare that a god protects the king or the king's son. In northern traditions, a master of ceremonies watches over order in public events. In many cultures, a household and a field are imagined as having their own protective presence. When a language possesses an old verb for guarding and preserving, it can compress that idea into a name ending that signals tutelary power. One plausible pathway is a protective verb that, through normal sound changes and the insertion of consonants used to form nouns, becomes a word for protection itself. From there, it can solidify into a name-forming element attached to different roots. A harbour spirit becomes harbour plus protector. A life spirit becomes life plus protector. A seasonal or change deity becomes season plus protector. That last example is especially telling. The god associated with shifts in nature and in human exchange is more convincingly named from an ancient season and renewal root than from a simple Latin verb meaning to turn. The concept is not turning in the mechanical sense, but the renewing cycle of time, growth, and commerce. With that reading, the name becomes a compact portrait of the god's role, the protective power over change itself. When the ending tumnus appears in Old Italic divine names, it invites a closer look at how sounds shift over time. In several languages, an initial T can soften, fade, or disappear altogether, especially when the word is placed inside a compound. What began as a firm consonant may turn into a faint breath, and finally leave no trace at all. Through that process, forms such as umnus can stand beside the fuller tumnus without representing a different idea. The name volumnus, for example, can be understood as a shortened echo of an older voltumnus, a deity imagined as the power that guides and restrains human intention. In epic tradition, the goddess identified with this role resembles the figure known elsewhere as Minerva. She is portrayed as a force that touches the hidden springs of decision, shaping the purposes of rulers and ordinary people alike. In Etruria, her sanctuary served as a meeting place for the entire nation. Tribes gathered there, not only for sacrifice but also for councils where matters of common welfare were debated. And such assemblies recall the ancient mounds of other lands, where early peoples held their parliaments and sought the favour of the powers that guarded the realm. The element vol in this divine title points to the notion of desire or will. Many old tongues share a similar root for the movement of intention, and the resemblance between the Latin form and the Celtic word for longing is striking. This parallel suggests that the concept did not arrive as a borrowed ornament, but belong to the deep vocabulary of the region. The same goddess could therefore be addressed under two different aspects. As Voltumna, she directed the inner choices of mortals. As Minerva, she embodied the dawn-like energy that arms the world against darkness. Myths that show her springing fully armed from the head of the sky god reflect that older symbolism. Thought becomes action, and will becomes weapon. Another cluster of names ends in Tunis. Here, the sense of protection is even clearer. The root corresponds to a common verb meaning to shelter or guard, and it fits perfectly with the character of several minor deities. Mutunus and Tutunus, despite their later notoriety, were originally spirits who presided over the mysteries of generation. Ancient writers describe how brides were introduced to marriage under their watchful presence, a reminder that fertility was believed to require divine oversight. The vocabulary behind these titles can be traced to everyday words, for the body and its functions showing how religious language grew out of ordinary speech. Portunus illustrates the same pattern in a gentler sphere. He was honoured as the guardian of harbours, safe passages across the sea. Sailors looked to him for a fortunate return, and the close relationship between his name and that of Portumnus demonstrates how the two endings, minus tunus and minus tumnus, merged in popular usage. The Greek world recognised a comparable figure in Palaemon, whose title also hints at a protecting power associated with harbours. The celebrated Fortuna belongs to this family as well. Her cult, more prominent in Italy than in Greece, reflects an ancient habit of seeking divine management of chance. At Volsini, she was worshipped under the name Nautia, and each year a nail was driven into the temple wall to mark the passing of time. From there, her influence spread to Praeneste and Antium, towns famed for their oracles of lot and destiny. Emperors and foreign kings travelled to consult these shrines, convinced that the goddess who governed turns of fortune could be persuaded to speak. Behind the Latin form lies a very old idea shared with the Eastern world. In Syria and Mesopotamia, people prepared feasts for deities, who dispensed good and ill fortune, and their names literally meant the allotted portion. The same concept appears in many languages where words for cutting or dividing gradually acquire the sense of fate. In the Celtic speech of the West, a related term signifies destiny and the shortening of life, while another expresses nearness and sudden accident. When such roots are carried into Italy, they may easily produce the name Fortuna, the power that assigns each person's share. The influence of these beliefs can be seen in the geography of the peninsula. Cities of Etruscan origin often contain an element resembling the name of the Eastern god Bel, whose cult was widespread long before Rome existed. Festivals of fire in the Celtic lands, the reverence for Balder in the north, and Italian devotion to Hercules all point to a network of traditions that met on Italian soil. It is therefore natural that Fortuna, like Bel, was imagined as a mighty distributor of prosperity, a force older than the Roman state itself. A final group of names shows the ending minus unus without the preceding consonant. Faunus is the best known of these. He appears as a rustic spirit of woods and pastures, celebrated in winter festivals where young men ran half naked through the streets. Prophecy belonged to him as well. Those who sought vision slept upon the skins of sacrificed animals beside roaring waterfalls, hoping to hear his voice in dreams. Such rites closely resemble practices found among the Gaelic peoples, where seers waited for revelations in lonely places. Faunus can be interpreted as the protector of cattle, particularly of goats and sheep. The first part of his name matches the Old Northern word for livestock, the same root that gave rise to terms for wealth and money in later Latin. In this view, he is not a strange monster, but the divine shepherd of rural life. The related figure Inuus, identified with the Greek Pan, may derive from a word for lambs and young animals, suggesting a more specific guardian of infancy within the herd. Ancient authors often paired Pales, Faunus, and Inuus as three aspects of one pastoral providence. Even Epona, the goddess of horses, fits the pattern. Her title combines the native word for horse with the familiar ending that marks tutelary power. Pomona, guardian of orchards, and Vacuna, patroness of rest, reveal how broadly this naming habit was applied. Each sphere of existence, if fields, ports, households, seasons, and the human body, was imagined to possess its own watchful spirit. Latin uses several words that can all be translated as temple, yet each one seems to point to a slightly different religious idea. One of them carries an echo of cleansing and ritual release, as if the place were defined by acts of washing, expiation, and purification. The other two feel older and more basic, as if they belong to the earliest layer of the language itself, which makes their original distinctions harder to recover by simple word history alone. Still, the way Roman writers use them hints that they were not interchangeable. One term appears to have been broader and more flexible, applied not only to a building on the ground but also to a chosen space in the sky where an observer searched for signs. The same word could even describe an open sweep of space without any clear reference to worship, simply a wide, visible field where a person could look out and take in a full horizon. The other term, by contrast, stays firmly tied to holiness. It suggests a consecrated enclosure, a marked-off sacred zone dedicated to a god, closer in spirit to the idea of a protected precinct than to the physical structure inside it. That wider word, the one that can mean a sky region as well as an earthly site, seems to carry an old association with the circle. The exact shape of the sky space was not always described with precision, but the logic behind it points toward an area that could be bounded and cut out for observation. The observer's temporary shelter, commonly described with the same name, strengthens this impression, because such a shelter is easiest to imagine as round. The earliest sacred boundaries in many cultures tended to be circular, and the oldest dwellings often share the same shape. Long before stone architecture and strict temple plans became standard, the circle already carried a powerful meaning. It was not simply a convenient form, it acted like a protective spell. A boundary within which danger was kept out. That protective force was frequently linked to solar symbolism. The sun's daily return, rising from darkness into light, was understood as the decisive victory over threatening powers. A circular sacred space open to the sky could therefore be viewed as a kind of imitation of the sun itself, or a mirror of its authority. This helps explain why certain public arenas were left roofless. The honours were offered beneath open heaven to a power already visible in the open. Before a permanent sanctuary could be built, the ritual expert first tested the site. If the signs were favourable, the building rose where the ritual observation had been performed, so the chosen ground itself carried the stamp of approval. In that perspective, the temple is not merely a structure. It is a spot that has been defined, bounded, and authorised by sacred procedure. When later generations wished to strip a place of its sanctity, attention was often directed at the foundations, because the holiness was believed to cling to the marked ground itself. This opens the possibility that the broader term refers primarily to the defined place and its immediate ritual apparatus, while the stricter term refers to the larger sacred boundary that surrounds it, the whole precinct declared off-limits for ordinary use. A useful way to imagine the difference is to think in terms of a centre and a ring. In many early traditions, the central structure stands inside a larger circular enclosure. The building may be the focal point, yet the holiness belongs to the whole space around it. If the sacred precinct was marked out as a ring, then the name for it could naturally arise from words meaning ring or circle. In that case, the temple would be the formal sacred point, while the fanum would be the entire consecrated circle of ground that embraces it. That kind of arrangement fits well with religions that pay close attention to sky, stars, and solar patterns. In such systems, sacred geometry is not decorative, it is part of the meaning. The precinct may be defined by a ditch and bank, by a ploughed circle, or by stones set in a ring. Even where the material form changes, the idea remains. Holiness is fenced by a boundary, and the boundary itself forms a circle. Old Celtic landscape terms can be used as a parallel because they preserve a similar logic. Two words can both describe an enclosure and yet not be equal. One refers to the larger outer ring that surrounds, protects, and contains. The other refers to the inner space, the central yard or dwelling ground. Stories set in heroic Ireland describe a visitor crossing the outer boundary first, then standing within the inner enclosure, and finally entering the house. That image matches the temple and precinct model. The outer ring is not simply a wall, it is the definition of the sacred or protected zone. It can later develop meanings such as fortress, palace, or settlement. But its earliest sense is a circular trench and mound that marks ownership, protection, and separation. The roundness matters so much that it becomes part of the word's identity. A second Celtic term, common in Irish place names, carries nearly the same force as the first. It can mean stronghold, palace, village, tower, and even fairy ring. The range looks chaotic at first, but it is unified by the same geometry, the round enclosure. A tower is a structure that turns around an axis. A fairy ring is literally a circle on the ground. A fortified settlement is a space surrounded by a curved boundary. When that term is joined with another word that signifies a trench or furrow, the result naturally describes a sacred perimeter, a boundary cut into the earth around a place. This kind of compound suits the ancient institution later known in Italy as the consecrated belt, that defined where a city could properly exist. The ordinary explanation that treats the word as meaning behind the walls fails to capture the older, ritual reality. Because the sacred boundary was not simply a strip behind masonry. It was the defining line itself, the inviolable circuit traced before walls, rows, and long before streets and buildings filled the interior. The ritual for founding a city illustrates this with striking clarity. The community began with offerings to secure divine favor and rites intended to purify the participants for the act of creation. Then, a bull and a cow, chosen for their whiteness, were yoked together and set to draw a plough. As the plough moved, it cut a deep furrow around the intended settlement, outlining its complete circuit. The crowd followed closely, watching the clods turned up by the ploughshare. Any soil that fell outward was carefully thrown back inward, as if every grain belonged inside the future sacred order. Once the circuit was complete, the animals were sacrificed. The city's first shape was therefore a religious act, traced in the earth like a covenant with the gods. The symbolism is difficult to miss. The circle evokes solar power. The white animals suggest purity and sacred light. The furrow itself becomes a boundary that cannot be casually crossed or violated. Markers were set along its course, and space on either side of it was kept clear. A wall could be built inside the furrow, aligned with the turned soil, or outside it, enclosing the entire sacred belt. but in either case the original act was the same. The city was born from a circular line. As the city expanded in later centuries, that sacred circuit could be extended, but only through rites that repeated the ancient pattern. The geometry remained, even when the urban reality grew more complex. From sacred space on the ground, attention turns naturally to sacred instruments in the hand. One object appears again and again across cultures: the staff, wand, or rod. It can be a sign of office, a tool of measurement, or a device of ritual power. In some traditions it appears in coronation ceremonies. In others it belongs to priests and high officials. In still others it is kept as a mystery, shown only at secret gatherings, and believed to strengthen or transform those who behold it. In priestly systems of the ancient world, bundles of ritual twigs or rods were treated as essential to sacrifice and divination. Such wands served as a visible link between the human officiant and the unseen order being consulted. In Etruria, the ritual expert held a staff of this kind. With it, the observer marked out the regions of the sky within which signs would be read. The staff was smooth, without knots, and curved at the top like a crook. Depictions show a shape reminiscent of later ceremonial staffs used in religious hierarchies, and the curve itself seems to carry symbolic weight. Even in other ancient iconographies, divine figures are given curved forms at the end of a beard or emblem, as if the bend is a sign of sacredness and authority. The same name was later applied to a curved trumpet as well. At first, that instrument appears to have belonged to religious use, but over time it became associated with cavalry and martial signals. The idea behind the name seems to have travelled from the wand's bent form to the trumpet's bent form, preserving a single identity across two objects. A Celtic explanation has been offered for that name through words meaning rod and measuring. In this view, the sacred staff is not merely a stick. It is a rod used for reckoning, marking, guessing, and interpreting. This fits the role of the ritual specialist, who reads patterns in the sky and converts them into guidance for the city. It also fits a broader pattern found elsewhere. Terms for measuring and numbering can overlap with terms for divination, because the act of foretelling often appears as the act of calculating hidden order. A horn used in worship, slightly curved, can likewise be linked to the idea of measuring and counting, not only to the idea of producing a clear sound. The same object can therefore sit at the crossroads of music, authority, ritual, and mathematics. From ritual words, the discussion can widen into a larger principle about naming. Names often preserve ancient ways of seeing. A single word can function like a compressed image, capturing the most striking trait of an animal, a tool, or a place. Over centuries, the sharp edges of meaning wear down as if the original stamp is rubbed smooth by countless tongues. Yet the earliest intention can sometimes be recovered. Animal names are especially revealing because they tend to begin as descriptions. Sometimes they imitate a cry, but often they point to a defining feature, a habit, or a pattern of movement. Bird names are a rich field for this kind of inquiry. Some birds are defined by power and speed, armed with hooked beaks and gripping talons, rising in wide circles to great heights before dropping on prey. Others are defined by watchfulness and cunning, gathering in noisy flocks, nesting high, wheeling overhead when disturbed. Still others are defined by long legs and wading habits, stalking through marshes and river edges in search of food. Across these groups, certain features repeat: harsh calls, circular flight, high nesting places, migration, and strong attachment to young. Some birds became symbols of piety, precisely because they were observed to protect and return to the home. Stories of birds refusing to abandon their chicks in fire, even at the cost of death, show how strongly such behavior impressed the ancient imagination. When languages name bird in general, they often rely on a root idea like movement, rising, or flight. Celtic terms for bird and wing can be interpreted as developments from a very old notion of motion. The same deep root can also branch into meanings that look unrelated today, such as sprouting and shining. In early speech, a plant moves from dormancy into life. The sun moves from darkness into light. A fledgling moves into full feathering and flight. What seems strange to the modern mind is natural to the ancient one. The shared concept is forward emergence. That is why a single root can generate words for flower, feather, and flight without contradiction. This also explains why terms linked to augury can grow out of common words for bird. If birds are read as signs, then knowledge and skill in reading them becomes a named craft. A title meaning bird knowledge can naturally become a word for a ritual interpreter. In that same spirit, a Latin term for the omen reader can be challenged if it depends on a crude idea like bird chatter. A more fitting explanation treats the second element as meaning sharpness, keenness, and attentive insight, because the omen reader is defined not by noise but by observation. The profession depends on trained alertness. Many ancient bird terms can be brought under two broad ideas: violent rushing and simple motion. The first produces names for predators, the birds that strike swiftly and seize. The second produces names for general flight, for going, sailing, and moving forward. From this second idea can also come words for fear, because sudden flight and panic belong together. When an army breaks, it flies, and the emotion behind it becomes a named terror. Over time, that terror can be personified into a spirit or god, but the original picture may simply be rapid vanishing, the shock of dispersal. The names given to individual birds, especially those of the predatory kind, reveal how early observers tried to capture the essence of what they saw. Instead of abstract labels, these words often functioned like small portraits. A single feature, moral character, bodily form, sound, or behaviour, was chosen as the key that defined the creature. When looking at hawks, falcons, vultures, and eagles, four main pathways of naming become visible: ethical admiration, physical appearance, the quality of the voice or flight, and the habits of seizing prey. Among the large raptors, ancient imagination often saw more than hunger and violence. The vulture, despite its grim diet, impressed people through its loyalty to its young. In Egypt, a particular species was treated with reverence and carved repeatedly on monuments. Its white feathers, unusual among birds of prey, matched the sacred colour favoured by solar cults, and its long curved beak and intense gaze gave it a noble appearance. The eagle, even more than the vulture, became the emblem of majesty. It could stare toward the sun without blinking, soar higher than any other bird, and strike with overwhelming power. For many cultures, it seemed a natural companion to the highest god, and its feathers became a badge of earthly kingship. Egyptian art even portrayed divine figures with the head of a raptor, and the ruler himself was imagined as the living reflection of the sun's strength. From this admiration grew names that treated the eagle or vulture as a heroic being rather than a mere animal. In several Celtic traditions, the word for eagle is built from the term for hero, joined to the ordinary word for bird, literally the hero bird. Another form describes the eagle as the generous or noble one, while German preserves a similar idea in a word that simply means the noble bird. Hebrew offers a different angle. The name of the white vulture is formed from the verb to love, reflecting the belief that this bird cared for its young with unusual devotion. Even Greek joins the same chorus by calling the hawk the sacred bird. a creature set apart from ordinary life. Not all names rise to such moral heights. Some are blunt descriptions of shape. The most obvious example is the Latin term for falcon, taken from the word for a sickle, because the beak curves like a reaping knife. Similar Celtic names refer to hooks, sickles, or bent forms, again pointing to the curved bill. A Welsh word for kite combines the idea of a spear-like beak with the general name for the bird. These terms show how carefully early observers studied anatomy and turned it directly into language. A third group of names imitates or alludes to the harsh cry that accompanies the attack. The Gaelic word for vulture literally means the screecher. Greek preserves a term derived from a verb meaning to make hoarse, used of a small hawk whose call is rough and dry. Hebrew contributes another word that describes a clamorous bird. Here, sound rather than sight provides the key to identity. Yet the largest family of names arises from behaviour, especially the violent manner in which these birds capture their prey. Many Celtic forms derive from verbs meaning to grasp or to seize. A single word can serve for crow, raven, kite, or any bird that clutches and carries off what it catches. The same root lies behind Latin verbs of taking and grasping, suggesting that the language of predation helped shape the language of possession. Other names stress the sudden rush of the attack. Welsh terms for falcon, kite, and kestrel all grow from a root that means to dart violently upon, while Greek provides comparable forms built from a verb of eager rushing. The image is always the same, the bird as a swift, irresistible force dropping from the sky. One Irish name for kite illustrates how subtle these formations can be. It joins the ordinary word for bird with another element that originally meant to strip or flay. Although the modern verb has narrowed to the sense of removing skin, in older usage it also meant to rob or to plunder. The compound therefore describes the kite as the bird that strips its victim, exactly matching its habit of forcing weaker birds to surrender their catch. A similar Celtic root, meaning to lead away captive, produces the common word for hawk, again portraying the raptor as a kidnapper of prey. From the same source grew terms for property and legal possession, showing how the idea of seizing could pass from hunting into social life. German and English names for hawk appear to share this ancestry. The same root that yields the Celtic verb to seize can be heard beneath them, and even Greek contributes a related term for vulture that combines the notion of rushing attack with that of grasping. These parallels suggest that widely separated languages once drew on a common stock of images when speaking of predatory birds. Another cluster of names focuses on the talons themselves. Gaelic phrases describe the vulture as the bird with claws, using the ordinary word for nail that also lies behind Latin and Greek forms. A name for kite comes from a root meaning to scratch, which at first seems odd until the older sense of nail is remembered. The path from scratching to clawing to naming the bird becomes clear. From the same family of words sprang terms for engraving and writing. Since to inscribe was originally to scratch a surface, even the Latin word for nail, and by extension the purple stripes of Roman rank, can be linked to this idea. The badge of status may have been imagined as something that fastened the state together, much as a nail holds wood, or perhaps the imagery echoed ancient representations of heroic figures, wearing skins whose claws hung upon the chest. One more habit of these birds left a deep mark on language: their circling flight. Eagles and vultures rise in wide spirals, and even smaller hawks wheel overhead when disturbed. This motion inspired Greek and Etruscan names built from a root meaning to go round. The hawk could thus be called the circler, a description that fits its behaviour better than any reference to colour or size. Persian shows a similar pattern, using a related root for both hawk and wheel. Such evidence supports the idea that the Etruscan term for hawk belonged to a broader family of ancient words, based on the image of turning in the sky. The Latin name for kite, on the other hand, highlights the result rather than the movement. It comes from a verb meaning to ruin or destroy, and the French form adds the element bird, giving literally the destroyer bird. The same Celtic root also produced words for heroism and soldiery, reflecting an age when the ideal warrior was praised for the number he could lay low. In that mental world, the predatory bird and the battlefield champion were close cousins. Another ancient stream of naming flows from a root that carried the sense of turning in a circle. In the Gaelic world, a verb built on this root meant to describe a ring, and from it developed the Latin idea of the gyrus, a whirling motion. German inherited the same image in its word for vulture, portraying the bird as the one that wheels endlessly through the sky. Gaelic descriptions of the vulture support this picture. One title calls it the eagle that tears its prey, while another calls it the eagle that circles continually above the earth. The language of circling was so powerful that it shaped even the words for around and about, linking movement in the heavens with the vocabulary of ordinary direction. Two further ancient names for vulture, one Greek and one Latin, belong to a different but related root that also expressed roundness. This root produced words for towers, mounds, and augurs, objects defined by curve and rotation. When the same element was applied to birds, it naturally suggested the creature that rises and turns in broad spirals. From it came the Greek term for vulture and, by a later change of sounds, the name for the turtle dove, a bird famous for its circular flight and faithful pairing. Even the Greek word for dove may hide this meaning, combining the idea of around with a sense of affection. The Latin name for vulture stands apart from later Romance forms, and seems to reach back to an older Italian speech. Its ending matches the Greek term just mentioned, and its first element may connect with the name of the sun god known across the Western world. If so, the vulture would have been imagined as the wheeling bird of the solar deity. Such an association fits the religious character of early Italy, where many institutions were arranged according to the number 12, echoing the stations of the sun in the zodiac. One of those ancient signs was itself the vulture. Conical mountains and volcanic peaks, sacred emblems of fire, reinforced the connection, and in Egypt the solar god was depicted with a vulture on his back as the symbol of the mother principle in nature. White, the colour of purity in sun worship, matched the plumage of the white vulture that lived in the Apennines and on nearby islands. It is easy to imagine that this bird, larger than any other raptor, could become the sacred messenger of a solar faith, long before the eagle assumed that role in later Rome. Legends surrounding the birth of the city on the Tiber hint at the same reverence. The tale that its founders judged their rivalry by the appearance of vultures may preserve a memory of an older Pelasgian tradition in which the white vulture carried divine authority. Though the details belong to mythology rather than history, they reveal how deeply the bird was woven into the imagination of early Italy. Turning from the birds of prey to those that wade in marshes and perch in trees, another pattern emerges. Cranes, herons, storks, ravens, and crows differ widely in habit, yet many of their ancient names are built from the same syllable. The key lies in the beak. These birds share a long, straight, pointed bill, either cylindrical or gently conical, and early speakers seized upon this single trait to group them together. Just as the modern word pike describes a fish by its sharp snout. so these older languages describe birds by the shape of their mouths. In Ireland, the crane is still known simply by a word meaning beak, and with added adjectives the same term identifies the stork, the heron, and the bittern. Greek and Latin display parallel forms in their words for raven and crow. Such agreement across cultures can hardly be accidental. The element at the heart of all these names referred to a rounded or spear-like point, and it perfectly matches the anatomy of the waders and perching birds. The ancients, without scientific taxonomy, nevertheless recognized a natural family through observation alone. A second term distinguished the longer cutting beaks from the shorter conical ones. The word originally meant the sharp tip of anything and passed easily into the language of weapons. From it grew the Latin name for magpie and the Celtic titles for kite and crane. The same idea of the spear shaped even civic vocabulary, giving birth to titles for citizens and gods associated with the weapon. Birds, spears, and social ranks were linked by a common metaphor of pointed strength. Ethical qualities also coloured the names of wading birds. The Hebrew title for the stork arose from a root meaning kindness and devotion. Ancient writers admired the bird's loyalty to its mate and its care for aging parents, and many peoples treated it with respect. Romans long refused to eat its flesh, while in Thessaly, killing a stork was considered as serious as killing a man. The black stork held sacred status in Egypt, and throughout the Near East, the white stork is still protected as a friend of humanity. Even Persian gives the heron a name that means the caring one. Such examples show how observation of behaviour could inspire reverence. Sound provided another source of naming. The crow's rough cry produced words meaning horse, and similar echoes shaped the titles of cranes and herons in Germanic and Celtic lands. Interestingly, the stork lacks such names, for it is almost voiceless, communicating only by the clatter of its bill. Colour contributed as well. Grey and white adjectives frequently accompany the basic terms, painting the bird in speech as clearly as in sight. Habits of feeding left their trace too. Gaelic words meaning meat or fish combine with the beak root to describe the carrion-eating crow and the fish-hunting heron. The Latin name for stork contains the same element, portraying it as the flesh bird. Each label captures a scene from daily life along rivers and fields where these creatures searched for food. From this network of forms arises a convincing portrait of the Etruscan crane name. The word resembles Greek and Latin terms for nose or snout, and it fits the bird's grooved bill with remarkable precision. Italian dialects once used a similar name for a species of heron common in the region of ancient Bologna, further linking the tradition to Etruscan territory. The crane's distinctive beak, marked by a channel along its length, explains why such a term would be chosen. The same root that named the crane also lies behind many European words, for nose, suggesting that the oldest languages viewed both human face and bird bill through the single idea of a projecting point. Greek borrowed its own term for nose from this source, while Latin and Germanic tongues preserve related forms. Such breadth of influence points to a very ancient stratum of speech, carried westward by early peoples. Other names illuminate the crow and raven. One Gaelic term describes the carrion crow as the bone bird, echoing Roman references to a vulture that breaks bones. Another word, imitating the bird's rough call, gave rise to the English rook. German and English names for raven stem from a verb meaning to rob, portraying the bird as a thief of fields and shores. The same root produced words for seizure and possession in many languages, again linking avian behaviour with human experience. The term vorsus sits in a fog of uncertain origins, partly because older systems of land measurement rarely match neatly from one region to another. What can be said with some confidence is that the word was used for a small unit of land in an Etruscan setting, imagined as a square plot, roughly 100 feet on each side, close in scale to a Greek ploughland unit used for field measurement. Beyond that basic outline, its deeper meaning becomes a puzzle with more than one plausible solution, and each path that leads through the way ancient people thought about land, as inherited property, as bought territory, or simply as a bounded patch defined by markers on the ground. One possibility treats Vorses not as a neutral measurement term, but as a concept tied to inheritance. In many early societies, land is not only space but lineage, and a share of soil can be spoken of the same way a share of goods is spoken of. Words for part, lot, and portion often overlap with words for inheritance, because a family estate can be imagined as something distributed or assigned. In that interpretation, the Etruscan word would belong to the same broad family of expressions that connect land to allotment. A plot as the portion that falls to someone, the inherited piece that carries a name because it carries identity. It is easy to see how a measurement term might grow out of that older social idea. A small standard share of land becomes a standard size of land, and a standard size becomes a unit used by surveyors, scribes, or local custom. A second interpretation is more practical and less tied to family rights. Here, the heart of the word is not inheritance, but boundary. Land is recognized because it is enclosed or defined, and the simplest way to name a piece of land is to name its edges. Across the ancient world, border words become territory words. A phrase meaning ends or limits can slide into meaning the land within the limits. In this reading, Vorses would point toward the idea of a measured enclosure, a plot defined by 4 sides, marked and recognized as a complete unit because it is bounded. The ancient habit of describing land by its limits matters here, because a small agricultural holding attached to a dwelling is exactly the kind of property most likely to be described as the bounded field, the edged plot, the measured strip. Even when the plot is not inherited, the border still defines it, and the border can supply the name. This boundary-based approach becomes especially tempting when one notices how many languages form words for land from the tools and actions of measuring. A rod, a pole, a perch, a line, a marker stone, a cord used by surveyors. These practical objects leave deep tracks in vocabulary. A measuring rod can lend its name to the measurement itself, and the measurement can lend its name to the land that fits it. In everyday life, people do not speak in abstract geometry. They speak in the language of stakes hammered into soil, lines stretched tight, corners confirmed, and disputes settled by pointing to a known marker. If Vorses once carried the sense of the measured piece, then its meaning would be close to a legally recognized plot. Land not as wilderness, but land made official by definition. A third route, quieter but still possible, derives the word from the most ordinary feature of a small rural plot: grass. If the land attached to a cottage is first of all the place where animals graze or where fodder grows, then a term for grassland can naturally become a term for the plot. This would make Vorses not a technical surveyor's word at first, but a household word, the language of daily subsistence. Over time, when such household holdings are counted, taxed, divided, or transferred, the everyday name can harden into a unit used by officials. In many cultures, the vocabulary of administration is built from the vocabulary of farms. Alongside Vorses, another Etruscan term appears in discussions of measurement and value: mantissa, a word used for an added amount that makes the balance come out right. The idea is simple and familiar even today. A small extra portion given to complete a deal, or a little added weight dropped onto the scale so the numbers match. Its deeper origin can be imagined as a fusion of two everyday notions: a small amount and a measure. In that sense, the word would describe the tiny addition that turns uncertainty into equality. A trader's world produces this kind of language naturally, because trade depends on trust, and trust often depends on the visible fairness of the scales. A make weight is not dramatic, but it is symbolic. It is the gesture that shows the bargain has been honoured. From there, the discussion of clothing terms opens a wider window onto cultural borrowing and prestige. The Roman outer garment associated with civic life and public order was treated as more than fabric. It became a sign of peace, a uniform of identity, a badge worn in ceremonies and state occasions, and in some periods it was protected as a symbol that outsiders should not imitate. Ancient writers themselves described its long journey through peoples and regions before it settled into Roman tradition. What matters for language is that the name of such a garment is often rooted in the simplest verb imaginable: to cover. The most basic act of clothing is covering the body, and across language families, the same small core idea can generate many related forms. Words for cloaks, clothes, coverings, and the act of hiding or shielding. A garment name that looks national can still be built from a universal root. In the same spirit, another old term for a cloak, sometimes treated as Etruscan, hovers between explanations that tie it to wool and explanations that connect it to similar-sounding words in neighbouring tongues. This is where the story becomes less about one word and more about how words travel through time. Wool is among the oldest human necessities, and names for it tend to be ancient, stubborn, and widespread. Yet the deeper one digs, the more one finds that words for wool, oil, brightness, whiteness, snow, and even shining celestial bodies can cross paths. The reason is not mystical, but perceptual. Early naming often starts with what the eye sees. Wool is bright in its clean whiteness. Fresh oil shines, snow dazzles, milk gleams. The same sensory impression can seed a cluster of words, and different communities can attach that cluster to different familiar objects. A term that begins as brightness in one place can become snow in a cold landscape, wool among pastoral people, and oil where shine and smoothness dominate the mental image. Once that pattern is recognised, the landscape of ancient vocabulary looks less like tidy boxes and more like braided streams. A single old root can be reshaped by small sound shifts, softened consonants, dropped initials and altered vowels, until it appears in new guises that still faintly resemble one another. Some languages preserve the older, sharper forms. Others preserve only rounded descendants. A word that seems isolated in one language can reveal its family resemblance when compared across several tongues at once. The oldest layers of speech often hide in short roots, one syllable carrying an idea like shine, cover, divide, mark, or measure. Those roots then produce whole families by small phonetic changes and by the addition of common endings. What emerges from this kind of investigation is not a neat verdict, but a way of thinking about language history. Ancient words can behave like fossils. They preserve traces of older environments and older lives. A community that first names something in a mountain world may build its vocabulary around snow, ice, and brightness. Later, when that community lives on plains, herds animals, and makes wool central to daily life, the same root may drift from snow bright to fleece bright. In a warmer region, the brightness might be recognised most strongly in oil rather than snow. Over centuries, migrations, trade, conquest and cultural prestige can spread the descendants of a root into new languages that reshape them further. The word remains, but the original scene that birthed it changes. So, Vorsus remains what it began as in the evidence, a small, defined unit of land in an Etruscan context, likely a square plot, recognised by practice and boundary. Whether its earliest sense leaned toward inherited shares, toward bordered territory, or toward the humble grassland by a dwelling, all three roots point back to how ordinary people and early administrations turned lived space into named space. The same is true of mantissa, whose meaning lives in the marketplace gesture of fairness, and of the old garment names whose roots return again and again to the simplest actions, covering, marking, measuring, dividing, out of which complex cultural identities are eventually woven. Many Latin words are often suspected of Etruscan origin even when no direct proof survives. Rather than turning that suspicion into certainty, the safest approach is to treat them as candidates, terms that look like they entered Latin through Etruria, but can only be discussed as probabilities. A handful of examples is enough to show the method. Trace the meaning. Compare how the object or institution worked in early Italy, and then test whether the sound and sense could plausibly align with older roots from nearby language worlds. Start with the public scene that every Roman recognized. The magistrate moving through the streets, surrounded by official attendants. These attendants carried the famous bundle of rods, sometimes with an axe set into it, a portable display of authority. The message was not subtle. The rods pointed to punishment, the axe to the ultimate sentence. Across early societies, this kind of power symbol is rarely unique. Frontier lordships and clan-based communities also built systems where a leader's household retinue enforced discipline, protected status, and performed public ceremony. Because the institution is so old, the names attached to it can easily be older than Rome's classical age and borrowed from cultures Rome absorbed. The title, usually rendered as lictors, fits that pattern. One explanation imagines it as a word that began as a simple label for a chief's followers, the people, the company, the group that stands close to a leader and moves with him. If a term for attendants hardened into an official title, it would explain why the Latin form looks more like a role name than a transparent Latin construction. The bundle they carried offers a second clue. A bundle is one of those everyday objects that languages often name with short, practical roots. If Latin adopted a local term already used in the region, the borrowing would feel natural because the object itself was so ordinary, even when its symbolism became political. The axe is more complicated because tool names travel widely and can be reshaped over centuries. Yet the idea underneath the word is almost universal: cutting, splitting, separating. Ancient languages repeatedly build their axe vocabulary from verbs meaning to cut, and the same core idea appears again and again in different families. Even when the exact phonetic pathway is debated, the semantic pathway is clear. The axe is the cutter. Once that is granted, it becomes easier to imagine how Latin could have inherited or borrowed a form that already belonged to a broad Eurasian family of cutting words, reshaped by local pronunciation and by the habits of official ritual. The same practical logic can be applied to other Roman institutions. Consider the ceremonial chair used by high magistrates. In Rome, it was not merely furniture, it was a sign that a man was exercising public judgment. A persuasive line of interpretation treats the name of that chair as meaning something like the justice seat, built from a root associated with right order, fairness, or lawful decision. In that reading, the word is less about wood and workmanship than about the function performed while sitting there. From the same root, Another civic term can be explained as the place where business is handled, a word that came to mean the council house and the political body that met inside it. When a community thinks of law, judgment, and public affairs as one connected realm, it is normal for the vocabulary to cluster around a single idea. The social world of Rome produces another candidate, the word for a dependent follower attached to a powerful patron. In practice, these followers were treated like an extended household. Protection flowed downward, loyalty and service flowed upward, and the relationship was spoken of in paternal language. That makes it easy to see why a word meaning children, kin, or clan could slide into meaning clients. The political structure of the city simply recast an older kinship pattern into an urban system of patronage. Once again, the meaning is the bridge. The term does not have to be born in Rome to become central to Roman life. Now, shift to the rituals of early conflict and the formal habits that developed around them. Rome used official envoys who were sent to demand repayment after a wrong, especially after raids and thefts that crossed borders. In an early economy, the most portable and most valuable property was not gold or land deeds, but living animals. Herds and flocks were wealth, and taking cattle was one of the oldest forms of aggression between neighbouring groups. In that setting, a state needs a recognised procedure. A messenger who goes out, recites a formula, demands restitution, and, if refused, announces that the dispute has moved into open war. A proposed origin for the name of these envoys ties it to a word family connected with animals roaming freely, especially the kind of livestock that grazed on shared or contested pasture land. The title would then mean, in effect, the men who deal with the missing beasts, officials born from border reality. Even the names of protective gods can be read through the same lens. Early Italy had a figure whose task was to push danger away, a divine repeller of harm. A suggested explanation breaks the name into the idea of driving away plus evil, a common pattern in older religious language where gods are described by function rather than by personal story. Over time, a functional phrase can compress into a single name, altered by pronunciation and by the tendency of repeated ritual speech to smooth rough edges. Whether the exact transformation is correct or not, the underlying mechanism is plausible. Divine titles often begin as verbal descriptions. Public engineering offers another likely borrowing. The massive drainage works of early Italy carried names that sounded older than the polished Latin of literature. A term for a sewer can easily originate in the vocabulary of trenches and channels, words that describe a cut in the ground carrying water away. If Latin adopted a local compound meaning water ditch or drain channel, the resulting form would fit both the object and the Etruscans' reputation for large-scale construction. Divination vocabulary is especially fertile ground for old loans. Rome hosted specialists who read signs in the entrails of sacrificed animals, and they were often treated as outsiders, brought in for expertise rather than honoured as the city's highest religious authority. That alone makes a non-Latin origin for the title believable. One proposed explanation connects the name not to birds or prophecy in the abstract, but to the sacrificial victim and the ritual act that produced the sign. The title, in this view, means something like the one who watches for the omen taken from the slain animal. Another approach shifts the focus to the animal itself, imagining the first element as a word for a ram or victim, with the profession name built around that central object. Both roots share the same logic. These terms are born from concrete ritual practice, not from philosophical speculation. The bird diviners, by contrast, were prestigious and deeply woven into Rome's civic decisions. Because observing birds as omens was widespread across the Mediterranean and beyond, the title may not be uniquely Etruscan at all. Still, the name can be interpreted as the skilled one, the sharp-minded expert in reading bird signs. That kind of formation, linking an animal domain with a word meaning intelligence or keenness, fits how many societies name specialists. The priest is the knower, the keen-eyed, the one trained to interpret what others only notice. There was also another kind of predictor associated with the sky and the air, a figure whose role seems linked to atmospheric signs: wind, cloud, storm, and the shifting behaviour of the heavens. A plausible origin for his title builds it from an air element plus a knowledge element, producing the sense of one trained in reading the sky. Whether or not the precise linguistic chain can be proven, the cultural meaning is strong. Divination systems often divide the world into domains: birds, entrails, lightning, air, and assign each domain to a specialist. Finally, even sacrificial language preserves old strata. Some ritual terms in Latin describe the moment between killing an offering and presenting it, and the verbs involved are not always straightforward. A word that later dictionaries interpret as to cast or to offer may originally have described a more physical gesture, moving the portions in a prescribed motion before setting them down, an action that signals dedication. Ritual vocabulary is conservative. It keeps archaic words alive long after ordinary speech changes. That makes it one of the most likely places for a foreign or pre-classical term to survive with only partial understanding. Taken together, these examples show why Etruscan influence is often argued in the margins of Latin, rather than in the centre. The strongest candidates are the words tied to institutions Rome inherited, to ceremonies Rome formalised, and to crafts Rome learned from neighbours: public attendance and symbols of authority, civic spaces and judgment seats, patronage language, border diplomacy, protective cult titles, urban drainage, and the specialist jargon of divination and sacrifice. Proof is rare, certainty rarer, but the pattern is consistent. Where Rome's life touched older Italian practice, the vocabulary sometimes carries an older accent, preserved in forms that look Latin on the surface while hinting at deeper roots beneath.